At 2:17 in the morning, Daniel Brooks was sitting alone inside a 24-hour diner outside Pittsburgh. In front of him was a cup of coffee he hadn't touched and an envelope that had been sealed for 22 years. Written across the front were only 6 words. Daniel, open this when you lose everything. Daniel stared at the handwriting. He knew exactly who had written it. His father. The problem was, his father had been dead for 22 years. And somehow, that letter had arrived on the worst night of Daniel's life. 12 hours earlier, Daniel Brooks had been a successful 42-year-old real estate developer. He owned a beautiful house outside Pittsburgh. He drove an expensive car. His company employed nearly 40 people. And from the outside, Daniel had built the kind of life people spend decades chasing. But by sunset, it was gone. A business deal Daniel had spent 3 years building had collapsed. His largest investor pulled out. The bank froze his company's credit line. And before midnight, Daniel realized something terrifying. He couldn't make payroll. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel had no idea what tomorrow looked like. So he drove. No destination, no plan. Just an empty highway disappearing beneath his headlights. Then his phone rang. It was his mother, Margaret. Daniel almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Her voice sounded strange. She told him she had been cleaning the attic of the old family.
An hour later, Daniel met his mother in the parking lot of a roadside diner. She handed him the envelope. Then she left. Daniel sat alone beneath the fluorescent lights, turning the letter over in his hands. His father had been a carpenter, not a businessman, not a wealthy man. Robert Brooks spent most of his life repairing houses, building porches, and fixing things other people had thrown away. Daniel loved him. But growing up, he was ashamed of how little money they had. Daniel remembered classmates arriving at school in new cars. He remembered vacations his family couldn't afford. He remembered his father coming home with sawdust on his clothes and promising that someday things would be better. Daniel had spent his entire adult life running from that childhood. Now, everything he had built was collapsing. And the poorest man Daniel had ever known had somehow left him instructions for this exact moment. Daniel finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and an old brass key. The letter began.
The next morning, Daniel drove north. The city slowly disappeared behind him. Concrete became farmland. Traffic became empty roads. And eventually, he reached Willow Creek. The old neighborhood looked smaller than he remembered. Then he saw the house. White wooden siding, a faded red porch, the enormous maple tree where Daniel had once built a tree house with his father. But something was wrong. The house wasn't abandoned. Smoke rose from the chimney. Daniel walked toward the porch. Before he could knock, the door opened. An elderly man stood there. His name was Walter Hayes. Daniel remembered him. Walter had worked with his father more than 20 years earlier. When Daniel showed him the key, Walter didn't look surprised. Instead, he smiled. I wondered how long it would take you. Daniel froze. Walter invited him inside, and then told Daniel something his father had hidden from him his entire life. Robert Brooks had never sold a house. Years earlier, when Robert became sick, he transferred ownership into a small family trust. Walter had maintained the property ever since. Daniel couldn't understand. His father had struggled financially for years. Why keep a house when the family desperately needed money? Walter walked toward an old cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were photographs, receipts, handwritten notes, and dozens of letters. Daniel began reading. Slowly. Then Walter showed Daniel the final document. It was a list of names. 31 families. Next to each name was an address, and beside many of them, a handwritten sentence. Paid back. Daniel didn't understand. Walter explained. Over the years, many of the people Robert had helped eventually became successful. A contractor, a nurse, a restaurant owner, a teacher, a small business owner. And when they tried to repay Robert, he refused the money. Instead, he asked them for one promise. Someday, help someone else. Daniel sat silently. For 22 years, he had believed his father died poor. But sitting inside that old house, Daniel realized his father had created something money couldn't measure. A chain of favors, moving quietly from one stranger to another. Then Daniel noticed one final envelope inside the folder. His name was written on it. He opened it. Inside was another note. Daniel, don't save the house. Use it. 3 weeks later, Daniel did something everyone around him thought was insane. He sold his expensive house. He sold his car. And he shut down the part of his company that had nearly destroyed him. But he didn't declare bankruptcy. Instead, Daniel returned to Willow Creek. Using what remained of his savings, he renovated his father's old house. Not to live in, to work from. He transformed it into a small nonprofit that helped elderly and struggling homeowners with essential repairs. At first, there were only 3 volunteers. Then something unexpected happened. Walter contacted several of the family. One winter evening, Daniel was locking the front door when a young man approached him. He looked nervous. He explained that years earlier, volunteers from Daniel's organization had repaired his mother's house after a storm. The family couldn't afford to pay him. Now, the young man had become an electrician, and he wanted to repay the debt. Daniel smiled. For a moment, he remembered his father walking through that same doorway with sawdust covering his jacket. Daniel could have accepted the money. Instead, he handed the young man a card with another family's address and said, "Don't pay me. Help them." The young man looked at the card, then smiled.